responsibility to do our best to share the truth in love. In fact, where it calls him the God of this world, the Apostle Paul says he has blinded the minds of them who believe not the gospel. And so we have a responsibility then as Christians to be informed on these kinds of things so that we can share the truth with unbelievers and so that we can avoid being deceived or falling into any other satanic traps like unforgiveness, hubris, pride, any of those things. It's essential.
You're listening to Faith in Action. I'm your host, Matthew Nowlin.
And I'm Sean Graham.
We lead Conservative Christians of Tennessee, and we are thankful you're listening to the show. Conservative Christians of Tennessee exists to analyze political policy and politicians in Tennessee, and all from a conservative Christian worldview. We want to glorify God by helping you to glorify God, so please don't hesitate to send us any questions or comments via email. You can reach me directly by emailing matthew@tnchristian.com.
Or Sean, SHAWN, @tnchristian.com.
On X, I'm @MNBookman. Today's show is sponsored in the West Tennessee area by the #1 lawn care company in the Mid-South, Herbie Systems. Spring is here, and without enough nutrients, your lawn becomes more susceptible to diseases and pests. To effectively keep weeds away from your lawn, trust the experts at Herbie Systems. Call 901-451-8214 today and let them kill your weeds. Our scripture for today is from Psalm 119, verses 4 through 8. Thou hast commanded us to keep thy precepts diligently. Oh, that my ways were directed to keep thy statutes. Then shall I not be ashamed when I have respect unto all thy commandments. I will praise thee with uprightness of heart when I shall have learned thy righteous judgments. I will keep thy statutes. Oh, forsake me not utterly. Today we're going to have a conversation with an expert that a lot of you, our listeners, will know already. He's a smart guy. He has a lot of amazing, well-rounded areas of knowledge, both of the created universe and of the order that God has established in our lives, in areas specifically finance and government, I think are his areas of greatest expertise. At CCOT, we believe that the study of God's amazing creation is part of what makes a man of wisdom, and in turn, a godly leader. And a godly leader is really a discerning leader. Understanding discernment and its import was once an area of great concern in our churches. You need to latch on to the importance of discernment, and you need to pray for God to raise it up in others, and also that they would learn to teach it to others. Discernment should be recognized as a gift from God, something to be sought. But discernment sits atop a mountain of basic truth. How can we have politicians that will have good discernment and lead correctly if those politicians have never learned the basic of civics? How can we have churches that discern what specific ways they can make their communities better, what specific ways they can teach the Word of God if the congregants and students at that church can't read? How can we have pastors with good biblical discernment if they never truly learn at just a basic level of the Bible, but just beyond that, just even basic concepts of the good and the beautiful? What I want you to realize today is that the same power of God's Word that spoke our universe into existence is the same power that we see today coming from the Bible. God's law word has the ability to change our lives and the lives of everyone in the world that we live in. We encourage you to study the liberal arts, seek higher education, seek wisdom. But if you are not starting your education in the Word of God, then you're missing the greatest knowledge in the universe. Today, we're excited to welcome Alex Newman. Alex is the CEO of Liberty Sentinel Media, an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, a nationally syndicated radio host, and a consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. I'm not even going to try to list all the news outlets he has written for. Alex speaks regularly at conferences on topics ranging from education and economics to climate and international affairs. He's spoken at many conservative events, and he has shared the stage with people like Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and again, just a lot more than we have time to mention today. Welcome to Faith in Action, Alex Newman.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for having me, gentlemen.
We feel privileged. God's really put you in a variety of spotlights. What have been a couple of your favorite reviews on the Sentinel Report or even any other shows?
It's been a real blessing just to be able to talk to all these fascinating people. And, people often get impressed by the big names like, oh, wow, you had multiple members of Trump's cabinet. I'm usually more impressed by just the regular run-of-the-mill people who are doing incredible things right where God has placed them. Activist moms who are speaking out in defense of their children who are being sexualized and indoctrinated to believe in horrific, horrific things. What's very clear to me is that God has people all over Some of them are in government and some of them are in entertainment and military and areas that get more prestige. But I think a lot of his greatest people are actually just moms and dads and regular citizens who are doing what God has called them to do right where God has put them. It's been a real blessing now for many years to be able to talk to thousands of people. I've loved talking to climate scientists, to pastors and preachers, and I've loved talking to people in government to get their thoughts. And it's also a good opportunity to ask, do you know what God says about government? It's always a very fun two-way street.
I want to go back to what you said about being impressed mostly with just the ordinary people. When you're convicted by God to speak to somebody about something and you don't have institutional backing and you don't have experience speaking, you're just an unknown. I think that does take a lot of boldness. You said moms whose kids have been sexualized in schools. Is that one of the most impressive examples you've seen of a nobody going up against the institution in a brave way?
Yeah. A friend of mine, we were doing home church because a lot of the churches shut down during COVID. And one of my friends said, hey, my cousin just had this terrible thing happen to her daughter. They tried to turn her into a transgender. Would you like to talk to her? I'm like, sure. Her name is Erin Lee. I said, hey, Erin, that's a really terrible story. And I know this kind of stuff is happening, but very few people have the courage to speak out about it. Would you want to come on my show and talk about it? And she said, well, let me think about it. Let me pray about it. Okay. So we do it. And, overnight, she becomes this sensation because the story was so amazing. And so within a few weeks of having had her on the program, I'm getting emails from people who want to know, how do we get her on the show? And suddenly now her face is plastered on the TV screens of tens of millions of Americans. And all it took was a mom willing to say, we are not going to allow you to do this to our daughter. So it was a terrible story. It was this 12-year-old girl. They took her at school and they said, hey, you should stay after school for art club. So she texted her mom, can I stay after school for art club? Sure, you can stay for art club. She got out of art club, quote unquote. And her mom picked her up and she says, Mom, I think I'm transgender. What do you mean you think you're transgender? Where did this come from? Long story short, the art club leader had told these kids that if you don't feel totally comfortable with your sexuality, if you don't feel totally comfortable in your body, you're probably one of these things, pick one off the list. Here's some little flags. Here's my cell phone number, but don't talk to your parents about this stuff because your parents aren't a safe space. I'm a safe space. So luckily, this little girl had been properly taught by her parents. And so when she heard these things, she went and told her mom. And because of her courage, this girl not only resisted the terrible draw that this cultural phenomenon has on children, but she's now speaking out in an incredible godly way. They even created a documentary about this called Art Club. And it ends with the most incredible thing. It's the little girl thanking her parents for having the sense to stand in the gap and resist, even when all the experts were saying, well, she's going to commit suicide, even when the CPS was called to get involved. Yeah. So I just love stories like that of regular people who are faithful to God, wherever God has placed them.
Yeah.
It's awesome to hear that the voice of Christians, no matter how small, in the darkness, it's an amazing light. You've covered that for so many subjects. You got credentials to talk about economics and everything else. There's just so much we could get into, but we're going to keep you to 3 subjects today: current events, economic stability, and education. On current events, the news coverage on this Trump administration, it's very different than what we saw in the previous few years. How has this coverage been good? And do you think good for new media, specifically the Christian new media?
Well, it's spectacular for us. I think the establishment media has just scored the most incredible own goal maybe in the history of any business. They have basically left the field wide open for anybody with a microphone and some common sense to come in and take market share because people are tired of hearing the lies. People are tired of hearing the propaganda. And so it really has been absolutely incredible to watch this process happen. And it's not necessarily new. I mean, even back in 2016, I was astounded with just the data I was looking at. I was looking at YouTube numbers. I was crunching some numbers, and I saw all the big media combined had less views on their videos combined than Alex Jones's election coverage did. I thought, that's interesting. Alex Jones is supposed to be a fringe, nobody, cuckoo, wackadoodle, and nobody's listening to him. Well, he's getting more coverage than all of you. He's getting more eyeballs on his stuff than all of you. What is going on here? So I was fascinated by that. Eventually they banned him, of course, and that just made him stronger and bigger. But watching the media self-destruct like this, I think is actually very encouraging, because the enemy is using the fake media to lie and deceive and mislead, and in very real tangible ways hurt people. So now we see this big opening where smaller voices that don't have the institutional backing, that don't have the multi-billion-dollar advertising budget from the big pharmaceutical companies and whoever, are able to come in and really make a profound impact. And we saw it most clearly, I think, in the last election, where the podcasters were getting orders of magnitude more audience than the big established media. And I went to journalism school not that long ago. When I graduated in, I think, 2009. So maybe 15 years ago, I was in one of the top journalism schools. And over again, I probably heard this 100 times in every one of my major classes. You guys are the gatekeepers. You're going to decide what people are going to see. That's an awesome responsibility. And I was thinking to myself, these people must not have heard of the internet. Today, I mean, that looks like a total joke. They're not gatekeepers for anything anymore. You go on X and anybody has a megaphone. So I'm very grateful to God that this opportunity is opening up for new people to come in who don't have this kind of wicked agenda, this anti-God bias. It's really a phenomenal development.
I remember about 5 years ago, I just got to a point where I was like, I can hear a headline and maybe I have to go as far as a paragraph into a news story, and I can tell you what they're going to say, what they're going to leave out. I remember even when the Nashville tranny shot up Covenant, I think about a minute after we heard that headline, Sean, didn't I say this is going to be a tranny shooting?
Yep, we knew immediately.
That's when I knew that legacy media was dead, because I could just look and see the numbers are coming down. Do you feel the same way about legacy media?
What you said, I think, is so right on point in terms of now anybody who's been looking at this for a few years should now be able to read the news report and have a pretty good sense of what happened. Not by what they said, but by the little bit of information we have and what was left out and the spin they put on it. It's becoming very transparent. And what I think is so encouraging is that we're not alone in this. I think it's almost like a psychological operation here. They want us to think that it's just you and your wife. Everybody else believes the lies. Oh, baloney, right? Gallup just released a survey very recently. Less than 1 in 3 Americans have any trust in the fake media anymore. So it's not just me and my wife. It's virtually the entire American population that now sees. They may not understand all the details and the intricacies, but they know they're being lied to. They know there's agenda to take our freedom, to surrender the sovereignty of our country, to demonize Christians and conservatives. And that is really, really powerful. And I think it's going to pay dividends for the cause of truth, righteousness, and justice long into the future.
As Christians, we know that Satan is at work in the earth. We should have a sophisticated understanding of what's going on in this world, more than the heathens. How do you think that plays out?
It's a brilliant question, and I agree with you 100%. I sometimes get frustrated with my brothers and sisters who, we're not interested at all in what Satan's doing. We're just focused on the gospel. And yeah, we should be focused on the gospel. But the Apostle Paul himself said we are not ignorant of Satan's devices, right? We're not going to sit back here and be ignorant and allow him to deceive us, or worse, deceive our children. And from a biblical perspective, there are some theological essentials that all Christians need to understand. Satan has a great deal of authority on this planet. In fact, the Bible repeatedly refers to him using terms like the God of this world, the prince of the power of the air. 1 John chapter 5 says the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. Satan himself took Jesus up to the top of the mountain and said, look at all these kingdoms, look at all the glory of them. I'll give them all to you if you just bow down and worship me. And Jesus didn't say, those aren't your kingdoms. You don't have that authority. He said, no, it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. So we as Christians especially should be up to speed on these things, not because we're obsessed with what Satan's doing, but because we're obsessed with what God is doing. And we know Satan is the enemy of our souls. We know he roams about like a lion seeking whom he may devour. And we have a responsibility to do our best to share the truth in love. In fact, where it calls him the God of this world, the Apostle Paul, it says he has blinded the minds of them who believe not the gospel. And so we have a responsibility then as Christians to be informed on these kinds of things so that we can share the truth with unbelievers, and so that we can avoid being deceived or falling into any other satanic traps like unforgiveness, hubris, pride, any of those things. It's essential.
Yeah.
This is awesome. But I want to talk about the economy, and you're a genius on this stuff. Let's skip the obvious currency, inflation, that kind of stuff. There's some states that are doing things right now. Tennessee, Texas, Florida, a couple others are starting to mint their own coins and start to talking about backing currency with their own system. Do you think this is a legitimate claim, or is this just, moving gears and a lot of noise?
Well, I'm glad we're talking about this. This is a hugely significant story. I've been working on an investigation on this for over a year now. But yes, a whole bunch of states, in fact, Utah just last week passed an incredible bill laying the groundwork for what they're calling transactional gold. So the state now is going to be able to pay merchants in gold or silver and vice versa. And they're laying the groundwork here so that regular people can go out and do business with gold or silver, not necessarily carrying the metal around in their pocket, but at least some sort of debit card system. Now, Texas
But
was the pioneer.
like a glint system, right?
Exactly, like a Glint
Okay, yeah.
system. That's a very, very good example. In fact, the guy who started and runs Glint has actually been supporting these efforts, even though that's going to take business from him because it's such a good idea. And so the state of Texas kind of got the jump on these guys. 10 years ago, they decided to set up their state-backed bullion depository, and that's in operation right now. It's in Texas. You can hold your gold or your silver there. The next step, and I've spoken several times already with the representative who introduced this bill, Mark Durazio, they're now working on creating a debit card style system where whatever gold you have in your account with the Texas Gold Bullion Depository, you can then go out and spend with a merchant, and that'll just deduct the gold right from your gold account. And the merchant can either be paid in gold, the merchant could be paid in Federal Reserve notes, whatever he or she wants. This is hugely significant for a whole bunch of different reasons. But I think one of the most important is it gets gold and silver back in circulation. It gives consumers the option to store their purchasing power in something that's not going to be inflated by the Federal Reserve System. That can't just be created out of nothing. And it puts pressure on other states and the federal government to start taking this seriously. So it gets this discussion going where, well, why would we want to do that? Well, here's some of the reasons why. So that's one of the biggest problems we have, is that there's just not enough awareness of the mess that we're in, how we got into it, and how we solve it. So this is very much in line with the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10 says no state shall make anything other than gold and silver legal tender. So this is a huge development. It has gotten very little attention from the media. And I think in the months and years ahead, it's going to get a lot more attention, and rightfully so.
Does something like this, where you have gold outside of a few choke points, but if every state were to do this, would it make our border and our internal security more important?
Probably yes. There are, of course, risks with anything, but one thing that we know for sure is that gold has maintained its purchasing power for the entirety of human history. In fact, you can go back to the early books in the Bible, and you'll see people were using gold as money back then. I know a lot of people call it God's money, and I think that's an appropriate moniker. This new experiment that we have a private cartel of banks masquerading as a government agency, creating currency out of nothing, loaning it out, and then charging interest on it, is a massive threat, not just to our purchasing power and our economic well-being, but it is in itself a national security threat in the most real way possible. It enables this out-of-control government spending that we have seen now for several generations, at least going back to FDR. So yes, there are some risks with moving back to this kind of system. Obviously, bad actors are going to want to go where the money is. Why do they rob banks? Well, because that's where they keep the money. But the national security risks and the economic risks of allowing the current system to continue uninterrupted and unchallenged far outweigh any other risks that we might be looking at.
It's just one of many reasons that we take our border security and our internal security more seriously.
Absolutely.
Our good friend Nate Fisher and Josh Abatoy repeatedly say that a system is what it does. They're not the only people that say that. I'm not saying that statement is original to them. But in your book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, you enumerate a proof that the education system is not broken, but that it is working as designed when you consider the goals of its architects. Would an end to the Department of Education serve as a step in the right direction in helping our children?
That's a complicated question. I would say yes and no. It might be a baby step in the right direction. But first of all, I think it's going to be a very heavy lift. Yes, Donald Trump signed the executive order. Yes, about half of the staff has already been laid off, and they're hoping to lay off the rest of the staff. But this is a very, very complicated thing. There are at least 5 federal statutes that command the federal government to be involved in education in certain ways. And right now, a lot of what they're talking about doing is simply redistributing those functions to other agencies. A lot of it would go over to HHS. A lot of it would go to labor, a lot of it would go to interior, some of it would go to state and justice. So a lot of those functions that are currently handled by the Department of Education are just going to be redistributed to other agencies, at least unless and until Congress passes some laws repealing, all the way going back to 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that kind of put the federal camel's nose under the tent. And you can go back even earlier than that, 1962, 63, when the U.S. Supreme Court totally lawlessly, totally unconstitutionally kicked the Bible and prayer out of schools. But I think the best way to understand the education system is a hydra, right? Because a lot of people are talking about this as cutting off the head of the snake.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I wish it was. I'd love to celebrate something like that, but it's not. It's not a snake, and there's not just one head. It's a hydra with a lot of different tentacles. And combined, these tentacles are devouring our children. And you could chop off a tentacle, you could chop off 2, 3, maybe even 4, and the beast would keep devouring the kids. So we need to look at the mechanism as a whole and not just one tentacle. Yes, the Department of Education is bad. Yes, the quality of education has gotten significantly worse since we started wasting trillions of dollars on this monstrosity. But it was already a dumpster fire before we had a Department of Education. And so when I say the architects, I go back to the early 1800s. I mean, the first guy who seriously proposed that the government ought to take over child rearing and education from parents, Robert Owen, was a guy who was talking to dead people, air quotes, right? This was a guy who rejected the Bible and thought that communism was going to be great. Before Karl Marx, he wanted to get rid of the family, wanted to get rid of private property. These are institutions that were ordained by God. So the roots of this, the seed of this system, is anti-biblical, and you can't just sprinkle a few prayers and Bible verses on it and make it a proper Christian system. God did not ordain civil government to educate children. So I think we really have to go back to some fundamental questions and some fundamental presuppositions, like why do we educate? What is education? And on the subject of a system doing what it is designed to do and so on, Jesus gave us some really profound words. He's quoted twice in the Gospels, in Luke and in Matthew. He says, whoever's not with me is against me. And I think if you apply that to the government school system, it's going to be very obvious that we're dealing with an antichrist system. Okay, I don't care which way you slice it, no matter how you try to polish it. I think we as Christians need to say, you're not having my kids, period.
Alex, how many Protestants understand that the reason that we have public schools in the United States was to serve as a mediation and a multicultural system between Protestants and Catholics, that the Catholics recognized that they weren't going to have Catholic children. They were going to have Protestant children if the churches were allowed to run the schools. And if there is a small number that make that connection, schools convert. They're the greatest form of evangelism. I mean, we advocate on this show, don't abandon your existing missionaries overseas, but as they retire or die off, take those funds and put them into local Christian education. Love your neighbor that way. But if the Catholics took their kids out, seeing that it was an evangelism effort by the Protestants, how can we not see that it's the greatest evangelical force for humanism in the history of the world?
That's right. The humanists all saw that. That's what's so fascinating. I've got their writings. I've got John Dewey's writings. I've got Horace Mann's writings. I've got Robert Owen's writings. I know why they created this system, and it wasn't to lead your children to Christ. In fact, quite the opposite. So we have a real problem in this country now that we're about 5 generations deep into this experiment. And I think what you said is so important, Matthew. I want to reemphasize that. What's happening in these schools is discipleship. The question is who and what and why is discipling your children. And when you start thinking about it that way, you realize, wow, the government schools have my children 4 times more, best case scenario, than I have them. And Jesus himself told us, the student who's fully trained is going to become like his teacher. Folks, this is really profound. And I agree with you. With the Great Commission, yes, we are to go and make disciples of all nations. But guess what, brothers and sisters? That begins in your home with the children that God has placed there. That is not something that you outsource, even in the local church, much less to the government that is openly using your tax dollars to kill babies and all the rest of it. So I think this is one of the most important issues confronting Christians and the church in America today.
You just pointed out that we were 5 generations into this. Last week, we discussed that no denomination in America has stayed faithful to its roots past 5 generations. Maybe it'll follow
it's so
the pattern
crucial.
of every other religion.
We keep talking to all of our listeners about this. And Alex, I'm excited to have this conversation right now. In June, you're coming to the Culture Proof Conference this year with William E. Gaddison, and I am so excited that you're going to be able to talk on these topics and people get to hear more from you. You're a great addition to this lineup. Thank you for coming to this event.
Thank you guys for having me. I would love to meet everybody out there. This is going to be an amazing conference. I very rarely bring my whole family to a conference, but we're all loading up in the truck and headed up there. So I hope to see people there. It's going to be just outside of Memphis, and it'll be June 19th through 21st.
Listeners, you may remember Will and Miki Addison were on our show last year. This is that same family-focused conference that was a hit last year at Faith Baptist. So this year's culture-proof theme is Worthy of It All. Features an expanded lineup of speakers, including our guest today, Alex Newman, Ryan and Bethany Baumberger, Israel Wayne, so many more. This looks amazing. You can get tickets now at cultureproof.net. If you want your family to learn how to exalt Christ in every facet of their lives, you will want to put this on your calendar. It's, again, June 19th through 21st. To sign up, go to cultureproof.net. Get your tickets now before they sell out. Alex, tell our listeners where they can go to find more from you.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. I appreciate it. So my main website is libertysentinel.org. Sentinel is Sentinel. I'm also senior editor at The New American. I'm executive director at Public School Exit. But you can find all that right through the homepage, libertysentinel.org, and even the free newsletter. And really looking forward to coming up and seeing you guys in just a few months. So thank you again, gentlemen.
Well, folks, that's going to do it for another episode of Faith in Action. Listeners, we're glad that you're able to tune in each week from Nashville, Memphis, all over Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Kentucky, Missouri, and Alabama, as we talk about more ways to put your faith into action. If you want to hear more on this or other topics from a Christian worldview, head on over to botradionetwork.com and search for Faith in Action. There we have links to over 5 years of past shows, and you can listen to a wide range of guests sharing their wisdom about current events that affect Tennessee and the entire nation. And until next week, please remember our favorite promise from the book of Exodus: the Lord shall reign forever and ever.